the regeneration project itself has meant that different groups who are already marginalised, for example, the homeless, the poor, are further marginalised because of the developments that have actually happened. So in other words, the regeneration process, often propelled forward by private companies, is creating private spaces in these different cities where a whole range of groups are either unwelcome or they do not have the ability or the power or the money or the cash to actually go and do the shopping and the consumerism, which is part and parcel of that whole mentality and that whole discourse which is developed. So it means that what you have in these cities now is a whole process of regeneration, not just in the city centres, but across a whole range of different areas in the outlying districts of houses, for example, being regenerated, but being regenerated for what? Very much in terms of student housing and student accommodation, for example. Of course, students have got places to live in exactly as everywhere, but it does mean that the private landlords, as it were, who have these places and the various individuals who run them and manage them are actually making a lot of money out of the privatisation of space, which does mean, therefore, social housing, the social aspects of communality in the community are increasingly being either marginalised, neglected, or not taken on board at all. So when we talk about the mendicant, the poverty-stricken individuals in many respects, it means not just the very, very poor, but a whole range of groups who are consistently marginalised by that. Now, those who would defend this process would say, well, hold on, this is bringing cash, wealth to the city. Liverpool, and indeed other cities as well, that's maybe a debatable point, because you then have to ask the question, well, if people are focusing on regeneration, what does that mean for social divisions? Class, gender, race, age, sexuality. Liverpool is one of the poorest cities in the United Kingdom by any indices, by the indices of deprivation. What does it also mean in terms of ill health? What does it mean in terms of the medicalisation of behaviour? Many people taking legally prescribed drugs. What does it mean across a whole range of different areas in terms of schooling, employment, unemployment, etc.? So the drive towards regeneration, as I say, not just here, but in other cities, brings with it a whole series of other processes which are invisible, which are neglected, which are marginalised. And it's that issue which I think needs to be addressed as well. And I think it's based on the whole idea of a trickle-down effect. That by definition, if we bring these groups in, private developers, private landlords, privatised spaces, private shopping areas, that somehow at the end of the day, that will trickle down to the wider population. There's no evidence of that.
I was going to mention the trickle-down theory, because it is a case of however much money you pump into the city centre to build a commercial shopping centre or whatever it may be, just the idea that this kind of filters out is like a geographical version of trickle-down theory. But we're seeing more social stratification than ever. The indices of poverty and stuff like that. It's not really alleviating the problem. So this culture-led model of urban regeneration seems to be, as you say, just managing the mendicant as opposed to actually alleviating the issues.
I mean, the trickle-down theory has been well and truly argued against and indeed undermined and destroyed in many respects. If trickle-down did work, as it was supposed to, as it was articulated in the early 1980s by the Thatcher government, then how come 30 years on, there's more poverty, there's more unemployment, there's more social divisions, there are record numbers of people going to food banks, etc. If trickle-down worked, then we wouldn't be having those social problems. So it doesn't work in any respects. In fact, it's been a trickle-up theory, isn't it? Because the rich have got richer in so many different respects. So if you build a social order around that kind of argument, i.e. it's going to trickle down, then please show me the evidence with regard to that. And please show me the evidence in terms of locally, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, whatever, because the social divisions in these places, despite the ideological justification for regeneration, the social divisions are as profound as ever. The marginalisation is as profound as ever. The poverty is as profound as ever. And though that regeneration discourse has done little, or if anything, to deal with those major social problems, in my view.
These are commonly referred to as like business improvement districts, right? So they're there to improve business and stuff like that. But what's the difference in the way that they are run and managed as opposed to more public spaces? Because I've heard things like they have their own like security forces and it's completely private. Do they have their own sort of set of rules that is kind of outside of the public arena, if you like? Yeah. So no trespassing. There was one that said we're going to charge beggars like up to £1,000. That was swept away because it was just so obviously ridiculous. Yeah. So what's the difference in? Are they just handing it over to the private sector and saying, create your own rules?
In many respects, formal and informal. I mean, to go back to the first point, business improvement districts, well, let's have a debate about how you define business. Because to me, business is also about local businesses, businesses that may be slightly off the centre, who the evidence is in many of these regenerated cities have been shoved aside as well, So if we want to talk about business improvement, let's actually talk about local businesses as well, who may well need that support, often run in this city by younger people, as it turned out initially. So when they mean business improvement district, let's be honest, most cities mean business with regard to multinational capital. That's the bottom line for them. So therefore, how do we bring these individuals in, or these institutions, organisations in? What benefits do they think they're going to get or accrue to them when they come into the city centres? And crucially, absolutely crucially, how is the order of the cities going to be managed in order to ensure that profit maximisation becomes the absolutely central goal that they engage in? Therefore, the rules and regulations, formal and informal, governing how these cities operate is really interesting. Of course, private security guards, and that raises some really interesting questions about democratic accountability. Yeah. The case that was last year, the lad who died in Liverpool city centre, Mezi Mohammed, the inquest, we're still waiting in the inquest there. That is raising very, very interesting questions about the relationship between private security guards, the public, and the police, without preempting the inquest. Of course, it's just that broader set of questions. So there's the kind of, if you will, formal privatisation of that space, policed by private security guards. And then I suppose there's the informal privatisation of those spaces as well, i.e. you're not going to see many homeless people sitting down there, for example, in Liverpool 1. There's no doubt about that. Why? Because they're not, quote-unquote, welcome. They're not economically viable subjects. And ideologically, they present a problem, don't they, to the image of these individuals.
This hasn't solved all the problems by any means, this commercialisation.
No, absolutely not. Yeah. On the contrary, because at the end of the day, as I said earlier, the levels of homelessness, levels of poverty, levels of people going to food banks, etc., they're all up. This drive towards making cities of fun, cities of regeneration, etc., brings with it culture-led urban regeneration. It's brought a range of social problems. There's no two ways about it, around drunkenness, disorder, etc., etc. And I'm not making that as a moral judgment, I'm just saying that. And in turn, brings issues around, the treatment of women in city centres, sexual harassment, sexual violence, etc., etc. So the outcomes of the regeneration process and the construction of cities around a kind of cultural-led regeneration is itself immensely problematic. I think the really interesting thing about what happened in 2011, and it's less commented on, I think, is the state's response to what happened in 2011. Because if you look at what happened, a senior criminal justice official up here said that those who were involved in those demonstrations were going to feel the shock and awe of the criminal justice system. And that's exactly what happened. So a number of the people who were involved, who engaged in, stealing bottles of water, whatever, some of them faced the full force of the criminal justice system. So what interested me about what happened was actually the aftermath of it, because it raised profound questions, again, about the criminal justice system's response to those who are at the bottom end of the social order, how they are responded to and how the state deals with them. Now, bearing in mind, we were 3 years in 2011, we were 3 years into the economic crisis, the banking crisis and all the rest of it. Now, I didn't see anybody saying after that or during that even, well, bankers are going to face the full shock and awe of the criminal justice system. Has anybody found that? So the response,
Bernie Sanders, a little bit,
yeah, a wee bit, perhaps, but not no way in the same way that those who were involved in 2011 around the country. And that's the thing that interests me, because unless we actually recognise that differential in terms of both criminalisation, which we were talking about earlier, and the response of the state to individuals who engage in public order demonstrations or indeed challenge or are involved in public order issues such as the disturbances in 2011, unless we understand the state's response to those issues, then we're not going to get very far, because they're going to occur inevitably, given what the nature of the society at the minute. They're going to occur time and time again.
Yeah.
And I think that whole issue about criminalisation and about the state's response and why it becomes acceptable, therefore, to not respond to the powerful bankers, particularly in the cases that I was talking about earlier, not respond to the powerful in that way, but we are respond to the powerless in very specific, hardline, authoritarian ways. That seems to me to be the crux, in many respects, of the issues that we're facing in 2017 as well. Because there's few, when you look at it over that 8 or 9 year period, very few individuals, some have been charged, but still they are in the minority. And so we're left with a systemic, institutionalised set of processes where those in power are operating within a culture of impunity and immunity, while those at the sharp end of the criminal justice system, whatever behaviour they engage in, are feeling the razor edge of criminal justice in many respects.
And this has taken place both in law and through the way in which the riots and through working class people are kind of represented as well in the media. What was the kind of the media's sort of response to the riots? What was the kind of liberal interpretation?
Well, liberal interpretation was poverty. That was certainly one. Social deprivation, poverty. And of course, this is where it becomes a bit difficult. Of course, there's clearly an argument for or let me put it another way, individuals, we don't know what it's like to live in those really, really poor circumstances where your benefits are being cut, where, you don't have enough food to feed your kids. The problem is that by situating the argument totally at that level, it means that the politics of greed then doesn't get a look in, because bankers are not, unless I've missed something, bankers are not poor individuals,
Exactly.
So the argument, of course, is, one has to look at social circumstances. Marx, Engels and the rest of the social commentators in the 19th century articulated that much better than I could. But the other side of it is that liberal interpretation, Guardian editorials, etc., then kind of almost divorces that set of arguments from the arguments about the politics of greed. And what happens to those who then engage in the politics of greed in terms of fraud, etc., etc. So it seems to me that we've got to somehow marry an argument about power and powerlessness, the representation of the powerless. Because if one's talking about, social class, of course, that's a huge social division in our society. But I think actually trying to also think about the powerlessness of particular groups in relation to the wider social structure.
Do prisons actually alleviate any of these issues? Do prisons work towards a safer society? What is their efficacy? What's their use?
No, they don't. I mean, Ultimately, the argument that the prison operates to rehabilitate, to deter individuals from committing crime, to deter us, the law-abiding in the outside, is just pure ideology in many respects. They are there overwhelmingly to punish, right? To punish and discipline those at the bottom end of the social hierarchy. Of course, some bankers go to prison, that's undoubtedly the case. But generally speaking, we can go to any prison in this country or look at the overall figures. I mean, the number of people going through the system in a year, over 200,000, overwhelmingly drawn from the powerless in the society, increasingly minority ethnic groups, and women as well. So it's the poor and the powerless that go through them. So the question then becomes, well, what function do these institutions perform? Yeah. Well, in some respect, you could argue that they perform a function of regulating and controlling those on the margins, the economic and political margins of the society. You could also argue that they help to construct a particular ideology around who's the criminal. They're the dangerous individuals in there, whereas we are all the law-abiding individuals outside. And they also, construct an argument which is very much about, reinforcing that individualistic ideology that, crime is an individualistic event, usually overwhelmingly committed by the poor and the powerless, and those at the top end, are clean. They're absolutely clean with regard to that. So they help to reinforce stereotypes, images, ideas about what crime is, and thereby distract attention away from, for example, social harm and the socially harmful activities of the powerful right across the board. Deaths at work, environmental degradation, income tax evasion, bankers breaking the law, violence against women. I mean, that's a very interesting example because justification for prison might be, well, there's some dangerous individuals in there. Yes, one could argue that, particularly around sexual violence. But in actual fact, and that's not an argument for not detaining individuals that engage in that kind of behaviour, that's not my argument. But you could also argue that when those individuals finish up in there, what happens? Their misogyny is reinforced, and given the number of crimes of sexual violence against women in our society and the outside, they do very little to offer, I would say, protection, safety and protection in this case to women. So overall, they don't really provide us with a justification for their continual existence in their present form. They don't do that actually at the end of the day. And what successive governments have done is that they talk about the average daily prison population, 85, 86,000, which is in this country is the highest in Western Europe. But that allows them to talk about the prison population as if everybody in there is dangerous. But in actual fact, if one looks at the yearly figures, around 200,000, it's hard to get the actual data. But the people who are going churned through the system, through these warehouses for the poor, day in and day out, month in and month out, are overwhelmingly serving short sentences, are overwhelmingly drawn from the poor, the unskilled, the unemployed, poorly educated, etc. So unless you actually believe at the end of the day that it's simply the poor and the powerless who commit crimes, and some people do believe that, of course, they still do, unless you actually believe that, then you have to ask the philosophical and political question, well, why are we spending £4 billion a year on these institutions? Yeah. What use do they serve it? If one looks now at the way that welfare is constructed in terms of individuals who are on welfare or receiving welfare benefits, it's very clear that the evidence now is that their behaviour is increasingly becoming a problem, in inverted commas, for the state. And so individuals who want to claim welfare and who want to claim benefits are increasingly having to go through, as we know, I think, a whole range of hurdles and hoops in order to be able to claim their legitimate benefits, bearing in mind that we live in a welfare state. Yeah. And the impact of that is, allegedly, the impact of that now is definitely that what we're now seeing is, I don't mean allegedly in terms of people's, what's happening to people, I meant allegedly in terms of a welfare state. But what we're now seeing is that, a whole range of outcomes with regard to individuals, so that more people living in poverty, people increasingly having to account for themselves in ways which is totally outrageous, I think, in terms of the authoritarian response.
I mean, anyone's ever been through that system, it's just so draining.
So draining.
And traumatising.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it is traumatising. I absolutely think it is traumatising and terrorising in many respects as well, because, like the film I, Daniel Blake, the individual in that was both terrorised and traumatised in terms of what happened to them, and the impact of that on human beings then in terms of self-harm and self-inflicted death. And that's a big debate about that, because it's very difficult to get at the data with regard to it. So that interrelationship between welfare and seeing those individuals on welfare as, bodies without brains, to quote one of the commentators on it, and being understood as bodies without brains, overlaps into the criminal justice system, because these individuals require policing in the widest sense of the word. Their behaviour needs to be policed, their attitudes need to be policed, their understanding of the world needs to be policed in order to drive them into jobs which are at the bottom end of the social rung. So I think there's a really important interrelationship now between those on welfare benefits and the criminal justice system. It's integrated, arguably it always has been, but because of what's been happening now, the intensification in these processes is there in a way which, arguably wasn't there even 5 years ago.
What are G4S security guards doing in job centres and all of that kind of stuff? I mean, it's quite overt. And,
yes. Yes.
Again, you see that in I, Daniel Blake as well, is that one of the workers in there is absolutely horrible to this woman, and the security guard then throws her out. So, that security, I mean, Will Jackson may talk more on this, but that's kind of securitisation and militarisation of our society now across the board, involving a whole number of different groups, mainly private groups, as we were talking about earlier, private security guards, and the way that space is controlled and managed and regulated, which means that some individuals and groups are allowed in and others are not welcome in any shape or form. And the poor, again, bodies without brains as are socially constructed, have become the group around whom a whole series of different strategies have emerged to regulate and control them. And if that fails, they finish up in prison. So it's no coincidence that when the number of people who were unemployed just before they went into prison, and then they're coming back out and finishing up in a system whereby they can't get jobs, they've been stigmatised, they've been labelled, they've been denounced, and so the circle goes round and round. If you set up a society which is very much about striving for material goods, whether you're rich or poor, that is going to have an impact with regard to how people understand the world and the world around them. If you then have that society which is dominated by multinational capitalist organisations like Google and the rest of those technological giants, who are then helped to construct a whole series of mentalities around, well, let's just post up what you had for your breakfast. Oh, I've just had porridge for my breakfast. The Guardian said, and it was a great phrase, the looking down society. And that, in many respects, is really interesting, the kind of symbolically and politically, isn't it? That people are continuously looking down. And don't get me wrong, I'm not completely decrying the new technology in that score. Of course, it's got its places. But as Marx always said, technology depends on the social relations within which it develops. Exactly.
And this has been developed by a bunch of individuals and organisations in California whose political outlook, let's be absolutely honest, isn't exactly towards philanthropy and social revolution, but much more towards ensuring profits are going to be developed. Then one has to say that just perhaps that might have an impact, a conservative impact on the wider society. And I'm much less, I mean, I read John Norton a lot in The Observer, and I think he's really good on the impact of the new technology now and what's actually happening with it, And so if you put that into the mix as well, where people's political consciousness and I'm not wanting to talk about it in a deterministic sense, but their consciousness does revolve around updating profiles, etc., which may have its place. Maybe I'm just going to sound like Fred Flintstone here in the instance. I don't know. But there is, do you see what I mean? There is an element of that as well, which is part of the construction of
I do think
the consciousness that you're talking about.
I do think people have become increasingly sort of aware of it to some extent.
Yes.
The idea of like, you know, try and get off of Facebook for a while, or try and just, I don't know. This is the difference between sort of David Harvey and Paul Mason, for example. Paul Mason's all about the post-capitalism. David Harvey says basically what you just said, it's still going to be governed by the existing set of social relations, which has a big, you know, plays a big role in managing people and, you know, keeping people down. And
also punishing them. You know, that's what's kind of in some respects missing in both Harvey and Mason's analysis, you know, that actually at the end of the day, if people fall outside the scope of those particular parameters, then they need to be quote unquote punished. And that's the interesting thing about how the punishment apparatus works. Who gets policed, who gets punished, how do they get punished, why do they get punished, and what are the results of those punishment processes? Well, that is further marginalisation and further punishment will come through if they engage in further deviance. So the circle goes round and round, and we have a criminal justice system, £16 billion spent on it each year, £16 billion each year. What does that mean? And the interesting thing for me is one of the debates about austerity, which I really find, you know, problematic, is that the debates about the cuts and about austerity have become dominated by, I'm just talking about the criminal justice system here, have been dominated by the idea that if we restore the cuts, right, to the pre-cuts level, then the criminal justice system would work. Well, I'm sorry, at the end, between 1990 and 2008, I think it was over 1,400 prisoners died in custody. That's when the prison system was fully staffed. So I've got a problem with the argument about saying, let's go back to the pre-cuts criminal justice system. That debate's been dominated by the Police Federation and the Prison Officers Association. And if you dig down further, it's just a point made in The Violence of Austerity, Dave White and Vicky Cooper's book, edited collection. You start to dig down further, you actually see that even in the criminal justice system, there's certain aspects of criminal justice being cut, but others have not. So, for example, the militarised public order policing remains the same. But, for example, road traffic police officers cut to the bone. Now, you know, the number of people are dying every year on the roads in this country. Another family was wiped out, I think, last week, you know, where four dead and 3 critically injured. You know, that's an issue as well. This goes back to public protection. What do we mean by it at the end of the day? Who's getting protected? Who isn't getting protected? So there's a whole issue about the cuts there, the impact, of course, on the powerless and what's happened, you know, lack of access to legal aid, lack of the whole benefit cuts. You know, terrible consequences of those things. There's no debate about that in my head. But it doesn't follow that just because we go back to the pre-cuts level that things are going to work out there as well, you know, because the criminal justice system in the pre-cuts phase was authoritarian, violent, terrorising, traumatising, etc. So therefore, if we're going to go back to the pre-cuts criminal justice system, we cannot go back to how that system is actually operating. We need to have a whole issue about democratic accountability on the table then. Otherwise, we're just going to repeat the same issues.
Hasn't Theresa May just raised the pay for the police again? Was that something that took place recently? What do you think is the purpose of that? What do you think that sort of indicates? Well,
first of all, to definitely, how can I say, to bring the police back on board. Because the receptions that they have had, the Conservatives have had, because you've got to remember, when Margaret Thatcher, the first thing she did when she came into the office was implement the Edmund Davis pay review for the police. So police salaries went way up, police numbers went way up as well. That was based on the misapprehension that the more police you have, the less crime you have. And there is no evidence to support that whatsoever. And that's just in terms of conventional crime, never mind hidden crime like domestic violence or corporate criminality, etc. So that move, that more recent move, is very much to bring the Police Federation back on board right? And then it'll be the same with the prison officers as well, who have been equally vocal in terms of what's happening. But at the end of the day, again, if one looks at the 1980s, when the police were up to their full complement, reported and recorded crime was also going up as well, right. Particularly recorded crime. Yeah. So there's no correlation between the number of police officers you necessarily have and the amount of crime. But it's an ideological move. If you increase the police numbers, and Labour are talking about increasing them by 10,000, what is their role going to be at the end of the day? Is it about public order policing? Is it about social protection in the widest sense of the word for the poor and the powerless and women, minority ethnic groups, etc.? What are we actually doing in terms of expanding these numbers? And what do we expect them to be doing? Similarly with prisons. If we're building all these prisons, what are we expecting at the end of the day? What are they going to be used for, either consciously or unconsciously? So there's a really serious debate to be had. And this might be the moment now. It might be the moment for a debate to be had about the criminal justice system. But on the other hand, it seems to be Conservative and Labour are moving kind of on the same course. Well, when 10,000 police officers, but what are they going to be doing at the end of the day? And to whom are they going to be democratically accountable?
It's kind of odd then, because this social protection thing, it's like increasing police numbers is like a bargaining chip, really. You throw on the table, like, we're more interested in public safety because police equal public safety. This is, again, the public perception of policing, isn't it? That is there for public safety. And yet at the same time, what you've just said, we're moving away from that public safety aspect of policing, so things like traffic control and stuff like that are getting rid of, and it's just moving towards crowd control.
And but how do you define safety and protection anyway? You know, here and indeed other cities as well, I leave my house in the morning, try and get across a main road without getting run over, right, by, the traffic. I'm coughing by the time I get to the bus stop because there's no environmental protection any longer, is there? I may go to a restaurant this evening which may or may not have been inspected in the last 3 or 4 years, although I'm a vegetarian, but it may not have been inspected anyway, right? So it depends how you define public protection, doesn't it?
Grenfell is the obvious example of that. And again, who's going to jail for that? Just to bring it back to this idea of who gets punished for crimes and stuff like that. The disparity between sort of neoliberal theory and practice is really quite stark in that sense.
It's profound. It's profound. And, I wouldn't want to preempt it because one never knows, what might happen in terms of as a result of the inquiry, and then whatever criminal proceedings may or may not take place as a result of that, and who's going to be in the frame with regard to that. So, I mean, Grenfell's been a profound moment in terms of an element, certainly, of shaking the core of those kind of neoliberal people who are completely and utterly obsessed with withdrawing the state from everywhere, in every aspect of protection. But yes, in terms of protection and protecting individuals and communities and groups, is the criminal justice system the best way of doing that? Well, arguably not at the end of the day, because it doesn't actually protect whole series of groups from racist attacks or homophobic attacks or gendered-inspired misogyny or whatever. It just doesn't do that at the end of the day. The evidence is stark, and even the Rose and the right would argue that as well, or at least, no, they wouldn't argue, that's an overstatement. They might recognise it just a little bit, but at the end of the day, the criminal justice system for them is all about ensuring that those at the bottom don't challenge and don't contest the social order. It's about that regulation and control and constructing particular discourses and ideologies, which at the end of the day means that we focus on them. And we, the respectables, as I said earlier, are outside that loop because we never break the law, do we?
What do you think is going to happen with Grenfell then? Do you think it would be like a drawn-out 29-year Hillsborough type thing, or do you think justice will be swift?
Well, it depends. I mean, as I understand it, they have to go through, they're going to have the inquiry, and then, as I understand it, I don't think they can necessarily have the inquest until the criminal proceedings are done. I think, I'm not entirely sure, but I think that's the case. So therefore, the point is, you've got a whole series of different levels in operation here, haven't you? Right. You've got the inquiry, you've got the possibility of inquest, you've got the possibility of criminal justice interventions in terms of trials, etc. So as in that sense, it appears, at one level may appear to be drawn out. I don't think it'll be, in terms of Hillsborough or Bloody Sunday or those kind of inquiries, I don't think it'll necessarily take that length of time. But what the outcome is going to be in terms of social housing, responding to and dealing with those responsible for it, who knows? Clearly somebody has to be held to account for it. Somebody has to recognise, and the wider society has to recognise that these particular individuals, those individuals and groups, cannot be treated, labelled, denounced and demonised in the way that they were before the fire actually occurred, because we know people were complaining endlessly about what was going on, and they became labelled troublemakers, demonised. We don't bother to listen to them. We might have the occasional group meeting, but as the evidence is very clear, as the folk involved in the various Grenfell action groups, etc., clearly articulated, we were never listened to. We knew they didn't, but they wouldn't listen to us. So it's going to be, same with Hillsborough in terms of the criminal charges that have been brought there as well. There's these kind of interesting elements now where those who have been involved in, again, I'll not preempt the trial, those trials, but at least they're coming to court and they've been made visible, because that's the other interesting thing about certainly the invisibility of those groups until the fire started. Those other processes just remained hidden. About the cladding and about the accountability of what was going on, and about how the residents were treated week in and week out, etc. That's been made much more visible now, and raises profound questions about what we as a society are actually doing. So hopefully that crack that's there now might open up to become a crevice, and that in turn might open up to become much, much, much wider. And in that, out of that terrible, terrible thing that happened to those people, that terrible, terrible thing, then we might actually see something, democratic accountability. But obviously people should not have to go through that in any way, shape or form whatsoever to arrive at a solution to a problem that they knew about, the local council knew about in the first place. It's absolutely outrageous. And I think, us, whatever we do, we've got the right, and actually we've got the duty, that's the word I'm looking for, the duty to raise these questions, because these are not just questions of politics, are they? They're questions of morality as well. It's about the moral basis of what actually happened there, isn't it? And raise those questions both politically and morally. Is it morally right what happened there? Clearly it isn't. So how are we going to move the moral terrain away from ignoring people, denouncing them, demonising them, to a society which offers protection and which is based on morally sound foundations of inclusion? That's the $64,000 question.
Right.